Okay, we'll make a start, folks. So welcome to SOAS, and my name is Matt Eagleton-Pierce. I'm a reader in international political economy based in the politics department at SOAS, and I'm thrilled that there are so many of you who have braved the conditions today. There was freezing conditions, strikes, and World Cup build-ups. I'm certainly be cheering on Morocco later on, but it's really heartwarming that each and every one of you has come out today for this lecture tonight. And my colleague and co-host Sarah El-Ghazaz will be introducing our speaker in just a second. But I just wanted to give you just a flavour for the context for the event and the lecture that will be delivered by Professor Tim Mitchell in a second. And this is part of an inaugural lecture for a political economy research cluster, which has been strengthening in the Politics and International Studies department here at SOAS. And Sarah and I and others in this network anticipate that we'll be holding other events of this nature in terms of lectures and other engagements on some of the defining political economy questions of our time. And there's a dialogue that's always been active within SOAS, not only in terms of the politics debates, but also engaging with economics, development studies, history, finance and management, and many others. And so this is a demonstration of what a SOAS-branded political economy conversation it can look like, okay? And I want to say a particular thanks to the politics department for sponsoring this event, and don't sneak out early because we have a drinks reception just outside in the foyer area. And I see some of my students have arrived, and they've arrived at the correct time, okay, which is now, not at 6 o'clock when we'll be hosting the drinks, okay? So please, everyone is welcome. I tried to fight for mulled wine, but we couldn't make it, couldn't do it, but we have other beverages, okay? And this is part of, just to say, a package of events that's been celebrating the 60th anniversary of the politics department here at SOAS for this year. So we're delighted that Tim Mitchell is part of these events, okay? And finally, but by no means least, a big thanks is also needed for the team for the Histories of Capitalism and Race seminar series, which is hosted in the School of History, Religions and Philosophies. Henny Zia for bringing Tim Mitchell to this side of the pond. And so thank you, guys, for doing this. And then Sarah is going to mention another event coming up tomorrow, also through Tim Mitchell. But without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Sarah, and you can formally introduce Tim.
Thank you, Matt, for kicking us off so nicely. So thanks again to all of you for coming today. I couldn't be more excited that you're all here. I'm Sarah Qaziz, senior lecturer in the politics department. So I'll just jump straight into introducing Tim Mitchell, who really needs no introduction, but I'll try with a really short one that will not do him justice. But Timothy Mitchell is the William B. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University. He writes about colonialism, political economy, the politics of energy, and the making of expert knowledge. Trained in the fields of law, history, and political theory, he works across the disciplinary boundaries of history and the social sciences. Many of his writings explore materials from the history and contemporary politics of Egypt, where he has conducted research over many years. He is the author of Colonizing Egypt, Rule of Experts, Egypt Technopolitics Modernity, and Carbon Democracy, alongside numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals and public venues, and the editorship of several journals as well. He is currently working on a study of durability, examining how the more durable apparatuses for capturing wealth, characteristic of late 19th century colonialism, engineered a new method for extracting income from the future, a future we now inhabit precariously today, which he's going to talk about quite a bit, so I'm going to kind of leave him kind of do that work for us today. But on a personal note, just to say that this is very special. Tim was part of my dissertation committee many years ago, and it's really exciting to be welcoming him back and to SOAS. So thank you so much, Tim, for being here today, for inaugurating our lectures for the Political Economy Research Cluster. Thank you all for being here and for engaging with this lecture, but also all the future events that we hope to be holding through the cluster. And without further ado, Tim Mitchell.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Matt. And thank you also to Annie and to Martine, who was there organizing the other event that's brought me here tomorrow, in which you can find details about, I'm sure, off the SOAS website. In 2011, the United States Supreme Court removed restrictions on independent spending on elections by business corporations. They could now pool their unlimited funds through political action committees or PACs, and these super PACs, as they became known, since then have coordinated the corporate payments and run the political campaigns on behalf of this new corporate money. The comedian Stephen Colbert parodied that Supreme Court decision by setting up a political action committee of his own, which he named Americans for a Better Tomorrow Tomorrow. It's the way the Founding Fathers would have wanted it, he said, celebrating the event on his TV show of registering his new PAC. Would have wanted it if they'd founded corporations instead of just a country. The parody connected two themes: the problem of political life when extraordinary influence is exercised by business corporations, and a political rhetoric of postponement, a rhetoric that promises well-being and improvement through the promise of a better future, but a rhetoric whose effect is one of continuous deferral. That deferral is what I shall describe this afternoon as the alibi of growth. The era of fossil fuels has been one defined by the idea of growth. The ending of that era appears to require the end of growth, or its redefinition, or even its reversal. But what is growth, and how is it related to carbon energy? How did we come to believe that burning fossil fuels created a collective world whose defining character has been to grow? Within a generation, if things were to go well, which of course they're not, we might live in a world largely free of fossil fuels. And while that transformation can no longer happen rapidly enough to avert many of the calamitous consequences of their use, it does pose the question of a world without growth. If we want a world without growth, or with a different form of growth, I think it would help to ask how we came to associate growth with the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Now, the answer seems at first obvious. Over the last 2 centuries, the exploitation of coal, later oil and natural gas made available a concentrated, rapidly increasing source of energy that fueled manufacturing, industrial agriculture, mechanized warfare, the expansion of cities, and the territorial enlargement of trade and empire. That growth could be measured as something material. It appeared in the form of the expanding quantities of goods, numbers of buildings, miles of transportation, size of population, and areas of territory under colonial control. In the mid-20th century, however, as the era of European world empires faced collapse and was redesignated, particularly by US-based scholars, with a new term as the era of what was now called colonialism, word that hadn't been used significantly in that way before, A different metric of improvement was invented. Economists coined the term the economy. Of course, the word had been around, had older meanings, used usually without the definite article, but those were very different. And they devised a set of protocols and assumptions for estimating the size and expansion of this new object, which was summarized as the measurement of GDP. The gross domestic product was not a measure of material wealth. It was a measure of the circulation of funds through accounts. There were two kinds of accounts, representing just the two main sectors out of which this thing called the economy was said to be constituted: households on the one hand and business firms on the other, with the government forming a kind of hybrid third sector, acting as both a business and a customer, and a fourth, the rest of the world, or what used to be empire, comprising a fourth. Businesses produce goods and services, they pay wages, households receive those wages and use them to purchase the goods and services, with any surplus wages saved up and reinvested in this curious view of how the world works to produce more goods and services. The accounts were presented as a representation, and not of material wealth, but of income. The change from older attempts to calculate overall wealth to the calculation of gross income appeared to introduce a separation between the measurement of growth in this new form and mere physical expansion. A country could now grow without expanding its territory, enlarging its population, or even perhaps even producing more material goods. One might expect this decoupling, if that's what it was, to raise questions about the idea of growth. But on the contrary, the notion that capitalist modernity was defined not by cycles of expansion and contraction as before, or impoverishment and improvement, but by the logic of endless, uninterrupted, and exponential growth, became self-evident. Economic growth without end became the very measure of political well-being and progress. Now, the idea of exponential growth applied to forms of human life is clearly absurd, even just mathematically. The absurdity was partly disguised by the convention of drawing the vertical axis of growth on a logarithmic scale, which converts an ascending curve, which very rapidly heads towards a completely vertical line of growth, into a straight and steady line. But that absurdity just makes our fixation with the concept of growth even more remarkable. Growth is the abstraction that somehow simultaneously explains our relationship to the material world and to one another, and yet seems to misidentify it. How does it do this? I've actually asked this question before, including at a lecture here in London 2.5 years ago, without actually finding the answer previously. I think today I'm going to offer a new explanation. In the standard view, growth functions as a historical concept. It records the change in things from one year to the next, comparing those intervals, those yearly intervals or quarterly intervals, depending on how you measure it, and explaining our condition in terms of our relationship to the past. But the measurement of growth has played another role. It's produced our relationship to the future. And it does this not in a simple way, ideologically, as it were, by simply promising a future of prosperity. It has a more complex role, and as we will see, a double one. Criticisms of growth often struggle to distinguish between two ways of defining the problem, corresponding to two ways of measuring what it is that is growing. One is growth measured as GDP. The other is growth as, let's say, increasing extraction from nature. The first approach to the criticism of growth usually lists all the flaws in which the way GDP is calculated. The list is very long. There are many ways in which it fails as a measure of well-being. It excludes most unpaid labor, in particular the labor of householding, childcare, and human reproduction, a highly gendered and racialized exclusion. It includes, as contributions to prosperity, harmful expenses such as addictive or unhealthy consumption, or the cost of arms spending, police violence, and incarceration, so is racialized a second time. It does not value leisure except when it is paid for. It treats as positive the expenditure on medical treatment or repairing damage from the effects of global heating in ways that do not adequately value improvements that might have arisen from better provision for care of the person or the planet. It attributes no value to the exhaustion of finite resources beyond the increased cost of extraction as reserves are run down and more easily accessed supplies are exhausted. And includes no valuation for the loss of biodiversity, of species extinction, or other costs to life on Earth beyond those priced by human claims of property rights. These problems in the measurement of the economy and its growth were not discovered after the fact. In fact, they predate the invention of the economy and the creation of the forms of measuring GDP. Simon Kuznets, the US statistician who pioneered in the interwar period some of the methods of calculating national income, strongly opposed the including in the total of harmful expenditures, such as even gambling, prostitution, or the manufacture and purchasing of weapons. Criticisms of the way national income is measured have been made ever since and have led to continuous and almost entirely unsuccessful attempts to redefine the measure or replace it. From, for example, Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq's alternative indicators of development, which produced the Human Development Index, Daly and Cobb's Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare that was refined as the Genuine Progress Indicator, a 2010 report by Sen again with Joseph Stiglitz and Fitoussi mismeasuring our lives, why GDP doesn't add up, and many others. The failure of any of these alternatives to displace the role of GDP suggests that the problem of measurement of growth in terms of GDP is something more than just errors in ways in which we represent the economy. A second approach is to argue that the problem of growth lies not in the practice of measurement or mismeasurement, of how we value or disvalue nature and other non-economic goods, but in the underlying nature of capitalism. In one version of this view, what distinguishes capitalism is its extractivism. And capitalism came into being and expands as a specific mode of organizing the relationship, not only among humans, but between humans and the natural world. If capitalism is the expansion of value and appropriation of surplus through the organizing of labor to produce commodities, all this depends on the endlessly expanding processing of materials into goods. Capitalism addresses its own crises through further spatial expansion and through increased exploitation of materials from nature, which provide a constantly expanding reserve of what it treats as cheap or free gifts. Since capital relentlessly seeks its own self-expansion, capitalism depends upon material growth, and growth is always at the expense of natural resources. No amount of redefinition of GDP or better measurements of costs will free capitalism from this destructive and unsustainable relationship to nature. Growth is not a problem of improper ways of representing and valuing resources. It is the exploitative dynamic at the basis of capitalist modes of production. One could summarize these two positions as a question of whether the economy as measured by GDP is a misrepresentation or a mere representation. On one side, those who argue that we should replace the metric of growth, its measurement by GDP, with alternative calculations of well-being and become not necessarily anti-growth, but at least agnostic about it. On the other side, the theorists of capital, Andrew Sartori is a recent example, who argue that the 20th century conception of the economy is a relatively unimportant development because it is only a representation. It can be contrasted with a different kind of ideational process, that of abstraction. What's abstraction? It's a reference to those forms of repetitive, uniform processes that generate the effect of an ideational structure that governs us independently of the specific practices that are regularized and disciplined to create that effect. But of course, within that category, for the kinds of value theorists that Sartori is an excellent representative of, there's the phenomenon of real abstraction, of those abstractions, labor, property, value, that are fundamental to the working of capital as a mode of abstraction through labor, that depends upon the transformation of materials through processes of commodification. Whichever side one takes, both positions in this argument suffer, I'm going to argue, a weakness, and actually the same one. Whether arguing that redefining the way we represent prosperity away from growth is a method to solve the problem, or insisting that changing a mere representation cannot be the answer to the destructive dynamic of capital. Both positions share a common approach. The economy, while it refers to something real, they both agree, is a representation. Or rather, it is a representation, a mere convention, because it refers to something else, to a material reality, or to a process of material production. I'm going to propose an alternative. My argument is that the economy is neither material reality, as most ordinary people who encounter the term might assume, nor its representation or misrepresentation, a mere product of statistics. It is rather a specific way of organizing the effect of the material world versus its representation, namely in the form of the real versus the financial, or the material world and the system of prices and financial exchanges that merely refer to it and organize it. This effect, this mode of ordering things and appearances, is precisely the mechanism through which the capitalist, or as I shall refer to it, the capitalizing mode of capture, operates. Let me explain two terms there, the notion of effect and the notion of capitalizing. First, effect. I prefer the term effect to a grander term like abstraction, partly because it can direct our attention to many of the minor, seemingly insignificant practices, techno-political practices, the compilation of financial statistics in government offices or in the cash registers of large retail companies, or as we will see, the gradual process by which banks, for example, were separated from industry architecturally, legislatively, organizationally, after starting as two aspects of the same merchant life. And because the term effect, which carries the meaning of both effectiveness and also of a mere effect, of mere appearances, draws our attention to the always unstable difference between an abstraction and what it abstracts from, something that the term abstraction, once it ceased to be used as a verbal noun, indicating a process, usually fails to do. On one level, this argument is analogous to one I've made previously about, for example, the state as an effect, but it's also different because the effect is different. We're governed differently by the effect of the economy compared to the effect of the state. So while the economy is yet another mode of abstracting, like state, society, culture, the other major abstracting effects, if you like, whose process of assembling we fail to see in the shortcut of constantly referencing them as though they were objects or stable entities. So on the one hand, it's that. On another level, there is an effect of abstracting, of constructing differences that is specific to the production of the economy, and it is in the specifics of that mode that we have to understand and disassemble the question of growth. If the invention of the economy, its measurement by GDP as an object of inevitable growth, is not merely a way that we represent or misrepresent economic reality, but a form of measurement and calculation that is essential to the contemporary political process that we can label capitalism, to the organizing of its mode of capturing and extracting surplus, then it can be understood neither by dismissing the idea of the economy nor by redefining it. The task instead is to understand what it is that the economy, as an apparatus, as a mechanism, does. So that's on the term effect. Second, on the term capitalization. This will now, I think, be familiar to many because of the recent debates around the term, but perhaps not to anyone. I don't have time to develop it today. If you come to the seminar tomorrow, I'm not sure there are many seats left, you'll hear more about this. But in short, it's the claim that capital's mode of capture is not predation upon nature, nor even on human labor per se, although it may and does make use of both. It is a form of predation upon the future. It is a political legal mode of establishing flows of revenue stretching into the future, of rents, of profits, of fees, of interest payments, and many more that can be monetized or assetized, usually at a discount. Sarah referred to my current project as a study of durability, and that was one way I began to frame it, though it's become something a little bit broader, but that history of forms of durability, of modes of constructing techno-politically claims over revenue in the future is still central to what I'm trying to understand. And of course, those forms of payments in the future that can be monetized, assetized in the present, and provide both a windfall to those who organize politically and capture the apparatus, as well as a steady stream of rent or interest or other form of payment to those who acquire a share of those claims in the future, and still more income to those who find ways to speculate on those future claims. The effect of the economy serves to both organize this future on which capitalization depends, but also to make its capture and its assetization largely invisible. So that's just a note about those two terms of studying something as an effect and understanding a process of capture of the future or capitalization. We've known for some time that the economy was invented in the mid-20th century, for at least 25 years. It took a while to get people to accept that argument, but I think we're just about there, not in economics departments, but elsewhere. The term was not just a new word for what already existed. It designated a new object of politics and of planning, understood for the first time as an entity in itself, a stable domain composed of identifiable and measurable relations. And I'd argue that's the case not only with the term the economy, but even been suggested that a rival term, the economic, has an older history. It has a slightly older history, but as designating a sphere, a dimension of the collective world, even that is largely a 20th century term. The economy was invented, one could say, in response to crisis. An old world of imperial civilization, as I suggested, was collapsing, brought down by anti-colonial movements, by socialist revolution, the imploding of a monetary order based on the gold standard, the worldwide loss of material prosperity, and of course the rise of fascism. Scholars on both the left, Karl Polanyi, for example, on the right, Joseph Schumpeter, for instance, agreed that the market-based financial order that was what was known up until then as capitalism was at an end. Even John Maynard Keynes shared the same hope. By making capital goods, the supply of capital itself for those goods, so plentiful that interest rates would be reduced to zero, the result, he wrote, would be the euthanasia of the rentier, which was often a synonym for the capitalist, and consequently the euthanasia of the cumulative oppressive power of the capitalist to exploit the scarcity value of capital. In response to this crisis of capitalization, a new object then came into being, the economy, replacing earlier terms like business that had been used to explain capitalism. Confusingly, the name capitalism itself was retained, despite the consensus among scholars of various kinds that what had been referred to under that name was now finished. But the word was referred to describe both the old system pre-1930s and the new system coming to being, making it seem like a continuation of the same thing, so much so that economists and political scientists by the 1950s, started to imagine that the economy had always existed, even though they had learned of its existence only 10 or 20 years before. The economy, in contrast to terms like capitalism, previously understood as essentially speculative, finance-driven, bound up with imperialism, essentially unstable, rendered collective life as essentially stable because productive. It approached material relations not in terms of speculative investment, unequal relations of property, unstable flows of capital and currency movements, but of the circulation of products, meaning the goods and services whose prices were aggregated to calculate GDP. The new measurements became a wider instrument of government. In the United States, for example, the estimates were first published in 1947 as what was known as the National Income and Product Accounts, the NIPA accounts, and they provide the definition and measurement of what was aggregated as the gross domestic product. It was a measure specifically of production, the production of economic value, based on counting how much people spend on new stuff, on goods and services. Now, this was only a very partial measure of income, as it only that income that can be attributed to a factor of production, labor or capital. It excludes the purchase, for example, of used goods, including very expensive used goods, such as a one-year-old car. Only if one is the first owner does it contribute to GDP. Buying a second-hand car makes no contribution. It even excludes the most costly purchases most households ever make, the purchase of a home, unless it happens to be the first purchase of a newly built home that has had no previous owner. And the purchase of things that are classified as products, not classified as products, even though they constitute a form of property that can be bought and sold. I'll give examples in a minute. More importantly, to create the divide between the real and the financial, which I think is essential to what's going on here, it excludes the manufacture and purchase, even though its focus is on the productive, it excludes the manufacture and purchase of financial products, such as stocks and bonds. It also excludes income from the appreciation of the value of assets, capital gains, because the inventors of GDP, it's said, had no access to measure people's assets, houses, investments, and other things, but also because capital gains are not usually visible in the kind of annual snapshot represented by the measurement of GDP. This unmeasured process, capital gains, represented as much as 25% of the income in a particular place, typically in the US or here, the bulk of it going to the very rich, but not measurable in GDP. Something more, the peculiar way of handling financial flows. On the one hand, these national accounts did include payments for some unproductive activities, if they could be considered a service. Thus, for example, payment of interest on loans and financial fees are considered the cost of a service, even though service fees themselves are actually computed separately. And the payment of rent for housing is considered a payment for the services of being housed, even for housing, unlike in the case of the car, that was built not only the previous year, but for 10 years before, or 50 years before, or 100 years before. In other words, long after the cost of producing that item has been absorbed, that is still a service that gets counted into GDP. And that's the case even for housing, as I say, that was built long ago, where the rent has no connection. The rent charged has no connection to the original cost of building the structure or providing service, but is merely a charge imposed by the monopoly over access to landed property. Curiously, in the GDP, owners who occupy their own housing are considered in the national accounts to be receiving an equivalent income and are imputed to enjoy the service provided by the opportunity to live in their own house. This is kind of indication of how significant these kinds of financial practices are to what goes on, but the way in which they don't actually fit into a world that is being divided into forms of production and the forms of finance that are taken to represent that production. So even when you don't pay rent for a house, but you live in a house, you're imputed to have the equivalent income to enjoy the service provided by the opportunity to live in your own house. So curiously, all the reproductive and unpaid, mostly female labor of household living is not counted in the national accounts, but the house itself is recognized for its unproductive labor of existing. Now, property rents and interest are not the only modes of extracting payment from the control of assets that are construed as part of the productive economy, even though logically they should not be. Even the purchase of material goods and useful services includes a significant financial charge. It's very hard to estimate what that is, and it's actually German scholars who've looked at it most closely, and Scandinavian scholars, and they estimate that the price of everyday goods includes as much as 40% of its price. As much as 40% of its price represents the cost of the interest payment that the suppliers, the manufacturers, the distributors, the retailers pay to banks and other creditors to produce that good. So the economy is presented as a measure of material productive life, of the economic product that appears as the measure of our well-being. But it fails to distinguish not only the inclusion of many harmful products, as I mentioned, or the exclusion of environmental costs or other kind of unpaid labor or other kinds of unmeasured costs, but it includes within it an entire system of so-called unproductive payments for rent, for interest, and other charges that are recorded, if at all, as simply the cost of producing things. So there's a very curious way of both including and then excluding certain kinds of payment and charge and fee that are fundamental to this capitalized mode of living, of this living of the exploitation of the future. What I'd suggest is that the economy operates in relation to these modes of capture of the future by securing, in fact, not an account of how that actually operates, but a different relationship to the future. It builds in and reinforces a certain place for practices of credit and capitalization in the way I've just suggested, of modes of living at the expense of the future. But it does this through a process of disavowal. Credit money is everywhere in the system of accounts, but at the same time it is nowhere. It is everywhere because what is measured is not resources or material products or labor or inequality, but prices, flows of funds between accounts. It's disavowed because money is seen as nothing other than the representation of something more real than itself, nothing except an intermediary. Finance, beyond its existence as the money of account that allows those flows to happen, is just a business like any other, like law, that provides certain services. In other words, in the definition and measurement of the economy, it not only established this object, but it reinforces a fundamental, but as we'll see, an entirely problematic distinction between the real economy and the financial system, between real production and mere finance. It both disavows that distinction and reproduces it. Now, the national economy was invented not just for wartime planning, but also, as I said, in response to larger crises. The one that gave rise to intensified anti-imperial movements in the interwar period, as well as fascism and war. The fiction of money as a commodity rather than as credit, that is to say, the notion that pre-existed this period of the value of money being fundamentally based on the value of gold, of a single commodity, that had failed, that had collapsed, and that was part of the problem. And central banks would now manage private creation of credit money through reference not to gold, but to the stability and growth of this productive machine, this economy, by projecting a steady future and, above all, for reasons to do with the very building of credit and acquisition from the future, one capable of continuous expansion. To understand the economy as a replacement in this simple sense for the gold standard, it's more than that, but that's one way to think about this. It's the thing that is going to stabilize and guarantee the very system of money. We must step back. Money is not just a payment system, not just a way of storing wealth. It is also, of course, and fundamentally debt issued, mainly these days by commercial banks, indebting the future. We're governed by debt in the ways that Lazzarato and many others have talked about. But not only the debt of contemporary so-called financialized capital, of home mortgages, of student loans, of car leases, of healthcare debt, particularly in the United States, of credit cards, all of which organize so much of life as a continuous and accelerated repayment schedule. But by the very phenomenon of what was always seen as the opposite of that, business, the organization of working life, including energy and other forms of infrastructure, social media, entertainment, travel, leisure, and more, all set up increasingly under the principle of firms owned by investors or shareholders, in which every process of capturing future payments from rents to entertainment to consumer goods and so on into the future is capitalized in the present and converted into an income stream available at a discount to be repaid later at full price. That difference between the discount in which things are acquired in the present and the full price in which it's paid in the future is the form that growth increasingly takes. While profits can be made from any one of these payment machines, their distinctively capitalist aspect is this process of capitalization, that is, their placement in the future as an apparatus of payment that can then be divided into shares, monetized in some form, sold, and traded in the present. Now, the creation of money, of the credit money that drives this system, is privatized largely in the hands of banks. And when banks create money, they charge fees. If all money is credit and all credit due to the power of charging interest, which I don't have time to go into, at a compound rate, has to be repaid at a cost that increases, of course, exponentially and is the root of the exponential growth of this object of the economy. At 3% interest, the cost of money doubles in 24 years, at 6% in 12 years. Another way to say this is that those who create or have access to credit money can purchase that future at a discount. An income of $100 or £100 available in 12 years from now can be purchased today at the discount price, thanks to this working of a system of capitalization for the price of £50. It's being increasingly widely understood, I think, that capitalism is capitalization, is a set of techniques and procedures for acquiring future payments at a discount in the present and profiting from that discount. What's not so clear, and what I'm trying to lay out here, is why the rescue and consolidation of this apparatus of capitalization in this moment of crisis in the mid-20th century rested on the invention of the economy. And to understand that, we have to step back, I think, a bit further, because this financialized capitalism that we're familiar with today is nothing recent. It's not something fundamentally distinct, I would argue, from industrial capitalism or even from commercial capitalism. It began in commerce, in a colonial and slave-based order that operated not primarily to supply goods, but through commerce and slavery to generate credit money, mainly in the form of bills of exchange. The shipping and sale of goods and of enslaved persons was the apparatus for this capture of surplus from credit, and it was a crisis in that system that led to the development of a different credit apparatus, the thing usually set up to the very opposite of a financialized system, the factory. What made even the factory a mechanism for the production of a system of credit? For the following reason. Once you bring large numbers of people together in the course of an industrial revolution to produce in a single place, you're presented with a very singular problem. This problem is called wage labor. It's a problem and it's an opportunity, and it's a literal technical problem and opportunity. How do you actually pay people wages in a system in which almost all money exists as forms of credit? there's very little physical money, coin or specie, was used in everyday transactions. I'm thinking largely of the case of the British Industrial Revolution, but parallel stories can be told elsewhere, including outside of Europe. Very little actual money was used in everyday life. Almost everything was handled through forms of book credit or promissory notes or bills of exchange and other forms of paper. The answer to that problem that these industrializing capitalists came up with, of not having any way to pay, but also not only the answer, but perhaps the very part of what was actually driving this process of bringing large numbers of workers together in a single place and organizing the control over their production. The answer was, at least initially, what's known as the system of truck. So truck is where a merchant pays his workers with some form of chit or voucher or just a line of credit in a book, which can then be exchanged later at local shops, typically owned by the same merchants, or certainly part of the same small community, exchanged for goods. It is, of course, and was historically, a highly exploitative system, because, of course, the same person was setting the rate at which credit money was created for the wage and the availability and the pricing of the goods, the product of that labor that they then bought back later at the end of the month, at the end of the year, with that form of credit that has been generated. And it was so abusive that Parliament passed legislation against it, notably the Truck Act of 1830 or 31, and that was actually the first step towards what became the Factory Acts, the whole series of attempts in the mid-19th century in the case of England to standardize and attempt to regulate the paying of the wage and the relationship between the paying of wages and hours of labor and so on. In other words, that work of constructing abstract labor that was done largely through Parliament and parliamentary reports and reformists of some sort, it didn't necessarily correspond to what was happening on the factory floor, which was always a much more messy and complicated process. I don't have time to go more into that history, but I want to suggest quickly, how are we doing for time? We're okay, right? Is that capitalism is still a truck system. It's one, however, that we don't recognize because it's been abstracted into the difference between what exists, as it were, as the factory and what exists as the bank. The distinctive aspect of industrial capitalism as it emerged was not the system of wage labor per se, not the separation of the producer from his object, from the object produced, nor of a system of production from the system of the market, the economic for the political, or any of those things. It was, I would argue, the separation of the factory from the bank. Merchants who had previously combined these two operations, even before the rise of factory labor, typically in a single business, separated, partly under the impact of this legislation, into those who ran factories and those who supplied credit. Modern private banking came into being as a result, and you had one institution that was issuing money, which was always credit money, and paid in the form of wages, who then take this form of credit and use it to pay back that debt to the banks through the purchases they make. Banks today still issue money as credit with no practical limit other than the availability of a reliable future that will get that created money paid back. The future in the days of the truck system was the merchant owning also the store where you went and bought it. The future of today is the one constructed out of the work of the making of the economy, and the system in which profit arises largely from the markup on those payments between what is given as wage and what is returned with that when that credit money is spent on goods, and of course, as also from, and increasingly from, the interests and the fees that are associated with that system of creating credit money. So the manufacturing of goods, involving, of course, hard work, low margins, constant threats of competition, soon gave way after the mid-19th century to much larger apparatuses of capturing future revenue that were much more long-term, much more durable, much less subject to the threat of competition, the building of railways, of utilities, of land development schemes, and many others. All of which, like the factory, were apparatus to create credit based on the opportunity to extract payments, rents, fares, freight charges, utility bills, and much more from the future. And subsequently, even industrial life, which had operated on this much more local basis, with them preserved mainly of family-owned businesses, was reorganized on the same principle. Now, this arrangement of truck depends on the production of that predictable future, which regulates and places limits on credit creation. If in the 19th and early 20th century this stabilization was attempted through this uneasy process of the gold standard, of pretending that ultimately money related to, in its value, to a real physical commodity, in maintenance of an invariable measure against which the issuing of money could be controlled, which in the days of the gold standard, of course, was backed by much larger forms of hegemonic imperial power that allowed that standard to operate. After that standard collapsed in the interwar period, it was reinvented, and it was reinvented as the economy, as a particular way of stabilizing and producing and explaining the monetary relationship between present and future. Note that the post-war construction of the economy and its growth, this is just in parenthesis, coincided and was often partly the work of those involved in the simultaneous invention of the concept of development, of economic development. And in fact, it's interesting to observe how many of the key early figures in the organizing of development theory, people like Phyllis Dean, Walt Rostow, or W. Arthur Lewis, worked out the meaning of development by going back to the history of the Industrial Revolution and wrote on both those subjects, and writing a completely different story. Nothing about truck, nothing about credit creation, nothing about the industry itself as this form of rerouting forms of credit and finance through new circuits, but instead around a fictionalized, backward-looking understanding of capitalism as a process of accumulating some kind of savings from the past, and doing that at such a rate, such a level that at some point you can reach a level of savings that you can then take off, in Rostow's famous words. That entire myth of savings to invest in industrialization, of course, not only ignoring the role of slave plantations and enslaved labors and wider colonization in generating the credit system, but also misunderstanding that credit system not as the generation of claims on the future, but as the accumulation of stores from the past, was nevertheless extremely useful in the post-war period as national economies were being used to discipline working populations in the West. Plans of national development were being used in a parallel way to discipline populations in the South in order to produce the same growth. So the calculation GDP, the measurement of growth, I think we can be seen as the creation through the economy of the structural effect that was required both to stabilize and disguise the generalization of a mode of living at the expense of the future. It did so by inscribing in the very object of politics, that is the economy, the apparent separation between the real and the financial. GDP was presented as the measurement of the real product, and the financial, although at work in every part of that system of accounts, was portrayed as simply the flows that allowed that real process to operate. So if the growth of the economy as measured by GDP in this view is neither a misrepresentation nor merely a representation, there remains actually the question which I opened with, which I'll just try and say something about very briefly, namely the relationship of this view of growth to that relationship of fossil fuels to the phenomenon of growth. Now, of course, the great acceleration of the post-war period that was launched and underway at the same time as this invention and making of the economy was in a period of astonishing increase in dependence on the burning of fossil fuels, and above all, in that period, oil. But the critical term here is the nature of this dependence. In what way was growth dependent on oil? We know that there's no simple relationship between energy consumption and GDP. The US, for example, began burning oil and consuming carbon at more than double the rate of most other industrialized countries, even those that began to enjoy a comparable or even a better standard of living. So there wasn't some necessity one can read directly from GDP to levels of carbon consumption. What I think the dependence on oil does reflect from that period was not a general dependence of modern life on very high levels of energy use, but its dependence on opportunities for capitalization, for building out a future revenue capture available in the present. And oil mattered on an enormous scale, not as a requirement for life, but as an exceptional means of capture of the future. In the post-war decades, as in fact through most of the 20th century, oil companies were the most reliable source of extraordinary long-term profits. A handful of companies monopolized global production, and the scale of production provided that the development of alternatives dependence, and nuclear power was the biggest threat for a long while, could be averted. It guaranteed more than any other industry a stream of payments far into a durable future, a stream of future payments that could be capitalized and consumed in the present. None of that capitalization represented the cost of energy production at all. It represented the discounted present value of an extraordinary future revenue stream, and what the oil companies invested in through their public relations, through their political manipulating, through militarization of regions like the Middle East, through advertising, lobbying, and many other kinds of promotion and opinion forming, was that future of continued dependence on carbon fuels. This was not just some, one more example of corporate publicity or promotion. It was a highly organized global level process. Curiously, over the last decade, of course, the oil companies, although profiting in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have lost that position at the top of the most profitable forms of capitalization of future income to a new kind of corporation, that being, of course, that handful of tech firms, Facebook, Google, Amazon, others, that actually now enjoy a far more monopolistic position than the major oil companies ever did in the 20th century. And of course, what they largely monopolize through their internet platforms and through other connections to the tech industry is the production of revenue that is generated in relation to further attempts to build out a future of varying forms of consumption. And of course, that's the reason why many of them live directly off forms of advertising revenue. Let me just conclude quickly. The problem of growth is approached as an issue of misrepresentation. It fails to calculate the true costs of capitalism, either by imposing an ideology of growth in some views that can be countered with degrowth, or by simply finding a new measure of well-being, or by failing to understand capitalism as a logic of self-expansion, which necessarily seeks cheap nature. The economy as figured by GDP is indeed a very recent invention, but it's not a misrepresentation, not simply a disguising or miscounting of the real costs of capitalism. It is the apparatus that saved capitalism, allowing its reconstruction, not in the forms of speculative instability that it had been known for before, but as a relatively stable mode of governing through the future. At its core is not a representation, but a method of deploying the difference between what is real and what is represented, between material production and the merely financial, and between the actuality of the present and the mere fictitiousness of the future. It produces the secondariness of finance, the difference between what is actual and what is merely money. The production of this difference is the mode of operation of capitalism. By organizing the relation between the present and the future, between today and tomorrow, and by governing us through the promise of today, a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for that incredibly stimulating and engaging talk. And I'm sure that you've planted numerous intellectual seeds into the heads of many people in the audience. So it would be fabulous to begin with just a roundup of a few to begin with. And there are some mics that which have they been deposited in the hands of anyone? Or?
No, they're on the stands.
Okay.
But maybe we could get a couple of volunteers. Would anybody be willing to? Thank you. Thank you very much. So who would like to? Ashraf, sorry, beg your pardon. My glasses, I couldn't see you at the back there. Yeah. Thank you. And so who would like to lead us off? Mira? Hello, thank you. I'll take the opportunity to maybe break the ice. Thank you very much, Professor Mitchell. It was a really generative and fascinating talk, and there's so much to unpack there. I wanted to ask you a question, and the general question is about the relationship, I suppose, between the technopolitics of managing the economy and the forms of resistance that might occur, because of course one of the historic ways in which wage labour continues to resist is through organization. But one of the key things, as you rightly point out, is the invisibility of many of these modes of power and the difficulty that poses. And one of the contemporary examples, I suppose, in society today is around the question of inflation. So some of the recent writing on debt and some of the left economists talking about inflation now make the argument, and I wonder what you think of this, make the argument that the tight control of inflation is specifically there to benefit the financial system. That is, it protects the value of loan repayments, essentially. And so inflation itself is an instrument of control of wealthy creditors against poorer debtors. So I wondered whether you agreed with that broad kind of analysis, and second, what you thought about, I suppose, the broader question of whether one can resist things like inflationary controls as a mode of resisting this wider system.
Anyone else? Yep, the gentleman just there.
Yeah, thank you very much as well. I thought it was a very interesting talk. Thank you so much. Building on this inflation question, you haven't really touched upon the emergence of central banks in this system of the economy, which has been also very much discussed in recent political economic writing as kind of the central element also of how neoliberalism is kind of managed. So I wondered where you see the role of central banks in the emergence of the economy, and how it fits in with this idea of the track system, which I found was a very original idea that I have never heard about. And maybe you could expand a little bit on how actually this track system then works for the economy, because I don't think I actually got that completely. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and just as a...
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I guess my question is a bit more philosophical, as the economic bits are a bit out of my comfort zone. But what this, what I got from this lecture is a different understanding of like the future and how we conceive the future within the metaphysical system of capitalism, and that, if anything, the like colonization happens in our image of what we project in the future as well. So I'm wondering whether thinking of authors that try to critique or try to think of queer futurities or different ways of understanding the future is potentially an act of resistance against what Mark Fisher defines capitalist realism and the impossibility of imagining anything that is beyond the system that we live in.
Yeah.
You just touched the mic there.
Thanks. So Mira first, on forms of resistance and particularly the current example of inflation. Part of this story of the invention of the economy was very much to deal with the resistance of labor in the immediate post-war period. I touch on that a little bit in an article I published called Economentality, How the Future Entered Government. How the very ability to sort of draw the future out as a line of growth, especially once you'd used a logarithmic scale so it looked very flat and very reasonable, you could then answer the demands of labor, and this was in the late 1940s, the period of the most intense labor activism and industrial action that the US, I think, had ever seen, and of similar things very much in the same period in Europe, that you could lay out that line and then issue warnings about what wage demands would do to that line. And it provided a whole new language and a whole set of techniques for that disciplining of labor. And I think that's pretty much exactly what you're seeing again today. So that's a slightly different aspect of the sort of deployment of the future that I was talking about, though I don't think it's disconnected, and it's the one I actually talk about in that article I mentioned, but I don't think it's disconnected, because it is indeed the production of the effect of a stable, calculable future that is operating to allow not just sort of predictions about the future, but for the very process of credit creation to continue, and this mode of capitalizing and capturing future revenue to operate effectively. And I think those critics were pointing out that tight control over inflation protects loan repayment, protects the value of that future income that takes the form of loan repayment is absolutely spot on. I think the thing to do is try and connect that to this larger thinking about how the economy itself is produced as this, simultaneously as that sort of disciplinary mechanism, but also a form of discipline that is the very basis of the modes of capitalization that that are essential to the capture of surplus. The question about, which is very connected to that, about the emergence of central banks, I didn't go into that, partly because, like the third speaker, I'm more philosophical and I'm a bit challenged by economic questions, which I hope you all bear in mind when you try and figure out how to figure out any of this stuff. I just, you know, thinking philosophically, you want to think about how things like abstraction come into being. And unfortunately, the kinds of abstractions that we have to deal with are not those of, well, they are still those of spirit and other more historical forms of abstraction, but they take this particular form of GDP and so on. And if we don't figure them out, we can't leave it to neither to the economists nor to some of the critics, as it were, to do this kind of work of thinking through how this political process of the producing of effects of abstraction and other things work. So on the emergence of central banks, you know, I could have said specifically that this work of figuring out how to stabilize and manage a process of credit creation involved not only the gradual separation of banking from the process of being a big merchant and attempting to regulate that legislatively by laws that describe the things banks could do and couldn't do and so on, but also the emergence of central banks, which of course happened in the United States, for example, much, much later than certain other countries. So this control of credit creation and the control of credit creation by the managing of a future absolutely involved in different countries in different ways the process of the emergence of central banks who could then use the kinds of calculation of the future made possible by the construction of the economy to play their role in then attempting to regulate credit creation, attempting to regulate the ability of banks. And the history of how that happened is fascinating and different in each country. The history of the Bank of England is, of course, so different from the history of the Federal Reserve System, their particular constitution as these hybrids of private and public in very specific ways, the kinds of crises to which they respond, and the ways in which, partly through that being a hybrid of the private and the public, of the commercial sphere and the government sphere, enables them to operate in the way in which they do. So it's absolutely central to this story, not one that I developed in the talk today. The truck system, T-R-U-C-K, nothing to do with trucks that drive on the road in America. But it is the word truck as used in Adam Smith's famous line about to truck, barter, and exchange. So, I mean, the way it works, it sort of lingered in some industries much, much longer than the ones it was first outlawed. So I think the 1830-1831 Act only outlawed it in certain sort of large factory-based systems, and it continued both among much smaller employees and in areas like mining much longer. In the US, it was notorious in the mining industry and elsewhere. And sort of justified on the basis of the remoteness of the operation, or on the fact, I mean, in Britain, mines produced their own coins. Silver mines in Anglesey and copper mines in Cornwall produced copper and silver coins, which were then used to pay, and they were just the coins of the mine that could be used to pay workers. So it's about creating a form of credit, and it might take the form of a coin or a token, or it might take the form of a paper chit, or it might just be columns of credit and debt in a firm's account books that credited workers or offered credit to workers in such a way that they were being recompensed for their labor, but then debited against that supplies. And often those supplies would be, if people were short of necessities, supplied in advance, and at the end of the month, very commonly workers might find that instead of receiving pay, they were further in debt than they were at the beginning of the month, and they would continue be forced, partly through that mechanism, to continue to work to pay off the debts that had accumulated. And the system was so abusive, as I say, there were efforts to outlaw it, and what the efforts helped produce through the Truck Acts and through other factory legislation was this much more abstract notion of wage labor that completely sort of eliminated from view, I think, the understanding of wage labor as a credit system. And I think that was, if you like, reproduced in the structure of the accounts that came to form the economy, because those accounts, as I say, because they're snapshots taken every year or every quarter, do not easily capture forms of credit and payment extended over time. And so in the sort of simple model of how funds circulate through accounts, there is this almost instantaneous payment of the wage to the household and the household's purchase of the goods. So there's no notion in that circular movement of funds between business and households back to business, that this is built upon a system of construction of credit money and the forms of profit and extraction that flow from the ability to manipulate and control that credit system. Of course, it's sort of more obvious today in things like second mortgages and other forms of extended debt, of subprime mortgages, of credit cards and many other things, but it's actually built into the way in which that system operated. The more philosophical question of how to see the future, what image is projected. So one of the things I'm trying to figure out how to do in this way of writing about the future is sort of break with the way that we have a rather different way of writing about the past compared to the future. We think the past is real and the future is fabricated. And I don't think that's helpful because, of course, the past is equally fabricated in a very positive sense of that term. We decide which parts of it to record, or we find some parts recorded and not others, and out of those we fabricate constructively as we can an account of the past. And I don't see that that's necessarily so different with the way we construct or build out forms of futurity that are usually seen as sort of a work of imagination or a work of speculation. And what I'm trying to do through this sort of more technical study of forms of durability, of actual techno-political ways of building a control of the future, are things that we can actually study as things other than processes of imagination or speculation. And a lot of the writing on the future has to do with those either imaginative or speculative aspects of it, the way in which the future involves elements of risk or uncertainty, and those are its defining factors. I don't think that's the case. I think uncertainty and risk are secondary products of the kind of control that are possible as you develop these increasingly powerful methods of commanding income from the future, whether through the capitalizing of a corporation or the building of an infrastructure that forces people into systems of payments over months or years, many other modes. One of the advantages of the reliability with which you can do that and the predictability with which you can construct that control over the future is not only that you can then break that up into shares and sell it to people. Here's your bit of claim on the future, to investors, to people with access to credit money to purchase that claim on the future. But you then generate as a byproduct of that a whole second relationship to the future, because on the one hand, this relationship to the future, what makes it profitable is the process of discounting. That's to say, I have here control over £100 that will be available in a year's time. I've come across it through building out this process of control, but I'll sell it to you for £90 at a discount because there's an element of risk. So the first thing is the certainty of the political control over the future. The second thing is the element of risk that attaches to that allows its discounting and that allows then the investor to say, oh, I can buy £100 for £90. I'll do that. That's a good deal. I don't need to have £90. I just need to have access to the credit system that gives me a claim on £90. And we'll call that discounting of the future the earning of interest, as though this was somehow some natural property of money, which is how economists started to imagine it, to justify and to ignore the technical work of constructing those kinds of controls. How that relates to the impossibility of imagining alternatives to capitalism, and the reference to the famous Jameson quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. Which way did it work? Yeah. I was sort of alluding to that when I talked about this moment that is very interesting to follow in writings from just about the time of and during the Second World War. Universal assumption, the end of capitalism. It was very easy to imagine. People assumed it had happened. As I say, from Polanyi to Schumpeter to Keynes. That was finished. And the question is, what form of political order do we invent to replace it? And what happened? They named the new system with the same name as the old system, and they called it capitalism. In fact, I think they used the word much more, because capitalism was much more a term used only on the left, I suspect, or in this more specific sense to mean a kind of speculator. But it becomes a general term, I mean, more or less synonymous with freedom in certain kind of American political talk. So you create the effect of the sort of enduring inevitability of capitalism by that inability to look at the way in which things have been transformed, which you get a much better sense of by reading the actual writers of the time. I mean, Polanyi not only wrote that way, but in his famous work that you all know the title of, The Great Transformation, thank you. He doesn't use the word the economy anywhere in that book. What was invented in that book was market society. But then 10 years later, when he's writing his book on ancient systems, it's the 1950s, so he has to use the word the economy everywhere and actually project it back onto an ancient world, existing either formally or substantively and so on, in debates. But that shift between the 1930s and the 1950s, I don't think it gives us complete answers to our question today about how to imagine alternatives, but maybe that's one way to think about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Any further questions? Yeah,
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned GDP as an inefficient tool of economic growth, and GDP is necessarily linked to economic growth because the growth is the ideal in this measurement. So do you think we should stick to GDP and maybe find a better way of measurement, or should we completely change the paradigm because the growth is not the ideal of progress and prosperity?
Okay, thank you. Is there another one? Yeah, there's a couple down here.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is about the main content of the talk is about the days the credits happen in the kind of post-industrialized society, and what if we take the rural indebtedness in this analytic framework? And I have read some contemporary anthropology or ethnographic work about like the contemporary rural indebtedness in South Asia or in Middle East, and I found it's interesting that actually the kind of days or credit system impoverished the local peasants. Such kind of microloans actually just made these peasants poor, even more poor, and also in the talk, the debt is or credit is viewed as in the virtual form, but if for those rural debts, when they are given in the kind of embodied material form, what will change in this, or what will be given in this analytic framework? And also, my second question is that because of the massive population movement between the countries and the continents, so here is a new phenomenon of migrant debt. And when we are talking about this, today's talk, it is more about the temporary effects of debt or credit. But for example, if I loan some money in one specific country, and when I immigrate to another country, and if I just successfully did this, the original country might not be able to, track my debt in my original country. So actually, this kind of debt ecologies has transferred or transcended its territory or spatial effects. And I was wondering, what if this kind of phenomenon can offer us some insights or possibilities about the date and its relationship to the future? Yes, thank you.
Thank you again. This has been really fascinating. My question essentially is, a question that's never very far from mind is the relationship, well, especially when engaging with your work, is the role of knowledge in kind of power relationships, especially in a post-colonial sense. The question I kind of have is, how does this fit into, how does the idea of growth how does the concept of growth being an unlimited kind of, being limitless, how does that fit into this kind of post-colonial kind of context of power? Sorry, that's phrased really badly.
Shall I go? Sure. So the one at the top there about GDP as an efficient tool of growth, should we stick with it or change it? I think the first thing is to understand it and use that as a way to understand why effort after effort to change it has not worked. And so what I'm trying to understand in understanding why that has not worked is to understand the work it does in organizing the form of life we have. And I think what's missing from many of the excellent attempts to come up with an alternative, which I've learned a lot from, particularly those that do look in detail at the ways in which GDP mismeasures the world for us. What explains the lack of purchase of those criticisms? And that's what I'm trying to get at here, rather than to come up with a different paradigm. Because while I'm all in favor of different metrics and different paradigms, I think until we understand why such an absurd way of attempting to represent our collective life took hold, unless we understand the reasons for that, we won't be in such a good position. It was the measures that came into being were sort of finalized as a wartime emergency, and that was part of the justification for throwing out the long supposition on the part of Kuznets and others that the last thing you can do in measuring GDP is include things like arms spending. I mean, if you actually want to have some measure of prosperity and well-being, then you've got to distinguish between positive and negative forms of spending. And that was abandoned. And part of the reason for that was the wartime need to think about how industrial production could be so diverted to effectively completely useless things that were being built either to be destroyed or to be left unused. But GDP itself really was formalized only after the war. And although those kinds of decisions had been made, one could argue that it wasn't a sort of accident or leftover of wartime thinking, but it was the accident of needs for a certain kind of wartime calculation that revealed the possibility of new way of calculating wealth in such a way that you didn't have to think about whether it was beneficial or not. And that explains part of its attractiveness. Of course, it didn't just get fixed in 1948 and then left the same, and it's been revised again and again and again. There's been some very interesting work and histories of those revisions. So there's a very nice article and a related book by Brett Christophers, and the article is on moving the production boundary, how finance became productive, which tracks the way in which the accounts were actually subtly redefined to turn finance from a cost into a productive element in the measure of the economy. And I think those kinds of fine-grained studies of these subtle shifts in accounting methods are really, really useful for understanding this continual sort of adaptability of the thing. This question here about forms of rural indebtedness and migrant indebtedness, the way in which people are impoverished by microloans, and the difficulty to the extent that forms of migrant labor include forms of going into debt, of course, to even establish the possibility of the labor and then the repayment of that debt. I think these are all really important, and as you remark, there's been a lot of work by anthropologists and others. Some of my own interest in aspects of that began with some research that I was doing in Egypt in the 2 decades ago now on schemes for giving property title to the poor, which were in vogue for a couple of decades, and particularly under the influence of a charlatan by the name of Hernando de Soto, who parlayed his views on this into a position as a leading development economist and candidate, at least in his own mind, for the Nobel Prize in Economics. And I wrote an article called The Work of Economics, How a Discipline Makes Its World, in order to understand how, again, such absurd ideas, so the idea is you give people property title and then they can take out loans and then they'll be okay, because what the poor lack is the money to invest in productive life. And all these schemes failed. But what I wanted to understand there was not so much the failure, which, as you say, anthropologists and others in these kinds of cases have done very good research on, but why this man was so celebrated in the discipline of economics all the way to the top of the field as a person who had found a way to solve the problems of the poverty of the poor. And there's a long history of that, of assuming that if we can just find ways to put people into debt, we'll make them rich. Sounds familiar, right? And I think those applies to both those kinds of cases you're talking about, both the history of rural indebtedness, of microloans, and of the kinds of indebtedness that go with migrant labor. And I think that just one's got to continually think about them with a very critical mind to the way in which the notion of credit is too often conventionally portrayed as the means to prosperity. How does this work I'm doing now on growth relate to sort of early interests in the colonial, the post-colonial, and questions of power, knowledge? Was that the question? Yeah. So I'm really just saying the same thing again and again. I hope you've realized that. And I actually did try and draw out some of those connections, particularly what it means to think of the economy as an effect. You know, what kinds of conceptual terms will help us find a vocabulary that can understand, whether in the form of the economy or in form of concepts like the state or many of the other key terms of social analysis, the way in what we take to be a structure or take to be some domain of the collective world that is sort of established and stable and should be a sort of taken for granted concept of our analysis, state, economy, culture, is not that. Its stability is in question, is worked upon continuously, and it has a history of certain ways of being produced and stabilized. And specifically using the word effect rather than the notion like structure or abstraction, because one needs to constantly get at that dual quality of being both effective and being ephemeral or staged in some way. Because one always wants to understand both how these conceptions and these ways of organizing and setting up our world seem to produce what appear as structures that govern us and manage us in all kinds of ways, with the fact that they do that through very specific techno-political, as I like to call it, processes that, because they are continually at work producing the difference between, let's say, the structure and what is structured, the economy and the real world, or any other form, they're unstable. They're hiding things, they're hiding the arbitrariness, they're hiding the way in which what is apparently separated out as difference, finance, or forms of financialization are actually written into the representation of what is actually supposed to be just a product or a material process. For me, the conception of that as the production of an effect is one way to get at both their technical production and the instabilities and the discrepancies that are the inevitable result of that. And the fact that they have to be reproduced continuously. They don't just sit there as structures that once done. You have to keep reminding everyone, oh, it's the economy is stupid, in the famous phrase of the Clinton election campaign. These have to be continually effected, and in the need to continually reproduce them lies part of their instability. And therefore, the question of power knowledge.
And any other further queries or questions? Yeah? Yeah, any? You can go, and then there's one other. Yeah, sure. Yeah, the mic's going to come around.
Thank you for that really fascinating generative presentation. I guess I just have a very basic question here. What's the relationship between the economy and the market in this new schema? And does it change from your previous way of approaching the market? I'm thinking particularly at the end of kind of carbon democracy, when you refer to the market as a new means of organizing or managing these kind of mechanisms of production. And just as an extension of this, you referred to kind of uncertainty and risk as secondary products of the mechanisms of the production and controlling the future. Does that then recast the market as one of the mechanisms, or a primary mechanism, precisely of producing this future uncertainty, as opposed to the classical kind of Hayekian formulation of the market as this kind of primary cybernetic means of control?
Thanks.
Did you want to go? Any?
Thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Very, very provocative and generative, and lots to unpack, as Mira said. So I actually just wanted to ask a sort of a question to clarify something that you've said, and to make sure that I've sort of understood it correctly. So I'm hearing you tell us that aside from the other sort of abstractions that you've shown to be effects, so you said society, state, culture, I mean, you don't deal with it as much, but sort of religion, there's something distinctive about the effect of the economy as an abstraction. And what I understood you to be saying is that what makes it distinct is the way in which it was in part a response to a crisis of empire, replacing the gold standard, and it was a new way of capturing the future. Is that a good way of sort of understanding what is distinctive about the economy? And then is the next step of that argument the fact that this economy, this effect of the economy, disavows something quite important that constitutes that apparatus of capture, and that is credit or finance, which is usually understood to be immaterial. So it kind of excludes it from its domain. Yeah, so if you could just clarify that for me.
Right, we do end it. Thank you both for both those questions. The first one about the economy and the market, and how does this relate to what I or others have written about sort of the market of neoliberalism as in various ways, let's say. So I think, of course, one of the really interesting things in writing about the history of neoliberalism over the last decade or more is tracing back its origins into the 1930s and Hayek's work then and so on. And I think what that enables one to do is to look at the sort of co-emergence of the market and the economy as sort of rival abstractions, if you like. One of which gets going very quickly and the other has to wait a generation or more before it tries to supplement or supplant the abstraction of the economy. And they really are working together. Actually, I think I touched on this. I published an article just a month or two ago in the Journal of Cultural Economy that is on Keith Tribe's wonderful new translation of Weber's Economy and Society, Volume 1, which I recommend Keith Tribe's translation and his introduction to that translation. But in my little essay about it, one of the fascinating things about Weber is that he is translated into English thanks to the intervention and the work of Hayek and the Vienna Circle. Because in particular they see Volume 1 of Economy and Society as an intervention in debates about planning. And some of my interest in getting into Weber and all that was because, having established this sort of interwar emergence of the concept of the economy, I wanted to know about figures from a slightly earlier generation, and Weber is a key one. And part of the problem that Keith Tribe has helped us solve is the mistranslations of his work into English, where it's assumed he's writing about the economy when he says economy, and he says more often a word that I think is better translated as economization. A process and not an object, and that's what I was picking out of Tribe's translation. But one of the interesting things about Hayek is that in the very act of publishing or organizing, the translation and then the post-war publication of Weber's work in English, is to track his use of language there at that moment. And it's one of the places you find Hayek referring to the economy, but only as the enemy, only as the thing that the socialists do. The socialists have the economy. He doesn't use it once in referring to Europe or the US, or let's say Britain, other non-socialist parts of Europe and the US. Those are free societies, and he never once uses the term economy. And I think you can see then in the work he does then and around then in formulating or transposing this notion of the market into this sort of information system is precisely a parallel to the work of constructing the economy as it were, a sort of information system that's going to rival it, but also later on supplement it. And I think that's interesting. That kind of work of the neoliberals in the interwar period is interesting to place against a slightly earlier history of markets, which I think are transformed, and others have written about this, in the late 19th century by an episode that I think is essential to this story that I'm telling about the capitalization of the future, because when you capitalize the future and then sell shares in it in the present, what you invent is a stock market. And to make those shares liquid, you don't invent it, but it becomes a very prominent institution in the later 19th century. And by making that future liquid and transferable and therefore capitalizable, what you've done is you've created for the first time something that either never existed or was seen as a sort of exception, a place where you can go and instantly discover the price of something, and where every item of that thing is identical with every other item, so can be traded, so questions of quantity are completely soluble. So what you can invent on the basis of that, of the institution of the stock market, is neoclassical economics, is marginal utility theory. No stock market, no marginal utility theory, because all the assumptions that are built into are assumptions that are constructed by stock markets in ways one could explain. So there's that moment, the 1870s, but then of course it's all collapsed in the interwar period, and that's where you get this reformulation around in the Hayekian form. So that's one way of thinking about the relationship between the economy and the market as these sort of parallel responses to this crisis in the interwar period. Risk, the market as a mechanism for the production of uncertainty. The production and I guess the pricing of risk, as it would be said. I think there's a lot in that question, but and of course a lot of literature in that same period that and later that begin to think about that. I mean, I was thinking of it mostly in terms of the particular forms I referenced around sort of forms of investment, shareholding, but there's a whole parallel history of things like insurance that are vital to this kind of, insurance is just about as important as bills of exchange as a way of producing credit and trading credit and forming, trading financial instruments and so on, in everything from, colonial commerce and shipping to the slave trade and many other things. So there's many people writing very interesting things about that kind of history of risk and uncertainty and so on that I think are important. And then Hanny's question about the ways in which the case of the economy is distinctive from other kinds of sort of abstract structuring effects. One can talk about society, state, religion, and write the histories of. Is part of the distinctiveness its emergence in response to crisis? I think that's worth thinking about. I mean, I suppose that's analogous in a way to the way in which Polanyi explains the emergence of society in the 19th century, completely as a response to society. Society had to be invented because of the crisis of forms of life in the 19th century, brought on by the ability of market relations to break the kinds of bounds they had been constrained by before. And so you need a countervailing mechanism, and that mechanism, that object, is not the economy, as he was later misread to be saying, but rather society. And so maybe one could think about that as a useful parallel for the emergence of the economy. And curiously, the second emergence is the moment that he is writing and thinking about that 19th century history in the 1940s, and reading the crisis of the interwar period, the collapse of 19th century society, in terms of the production of society as the thing that has to set limits to laissez-faire, to capitalism. But what that work in the mid-20th century lends it to, what that rereading lends it to, is actually this notion of the birth of the economy. And he's then read as having been writing about the birth of the economy in the mid-20th century, and he himself sort of almost sees it that way. So I think there is a relationship to crisis, which clearly I was saying without thinking about what the implications of that might be. Does it relate to a new way of capturing the future? Yes and no. I think these methods of capturing the future have been around pretty much as long as recorded collective life, but they were always limited. So the use of forms of credit in ancient societies and the extension of credit as a primary mode of profit in the ancient world, in medieval Islamic societies, very widespread and very dynamic in ways that I think too often are just written to assume that they were there to facilitate trade or they were there to facilitate agrarian production. And I think one of the things I'm constantly trying to do is say we don't have to assume it's that way round. Was trade there to facilitate credit? Was credit there to facilitate trade, or was credit this possibility of profiting that looked for means of facilitation, one of which might be trade, one of which might be the growing of crops, one of which might be converting those crops into textiles? How do you find continuously ways to not finance agriculture or trade or industry, but tradeify or industrialize the creation of finance? And I think that's equally true in the present, and is part of the way that I'm doing this little rethinking of the Industrial Revolution. Not that Industrial Revolution was a moment where industry needed to be financed, but for various reasons, again, of crisis as it happens in a colonial, imperial, and slave-based system, finance needed new forms, and the particularly form it happened upon was this strange process of bringing raw cotton from the other side of the Atlantic, industrializing it and shipping back. And I don't think you can explain that other than in terms of the crises in forms of credit and profit from credit that were occasioned by the worldwide disruptions of that period. So yeah, crisis again. This effect of the economy works by disavowing something that constitutes it, credit and finance. Yeah, and what I just said about that reversal is another way to think about that, I'd say.
Amazing.
Thank you for those wonderful questions and comments. And we have to close time on this, but the conversation will continue just over a drink if you want to, just out in the foyer area. But if we can all just give a round of applause to Tim for his wonderful
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, which I forgot to refer to, where you said this was a SOAS-branded talk, so I'm very grateful to have been branded, and look forward to further conversation.
One last thing before you all leave. First, thank you, Tim, for a really rich lecture and discussion, and to all of you for the engaged questions. We are continuing this conversation tomorrow through the seminar in Histories of Capitalism and Race in the Middle East and Indian Ocean that I've had the privilege to co-organize with Hani Ziai and Metin Biglari. So for that one, we're going to be reading 2 chapters that are from current book, for Tim's current book project that he really generously kind of shared with us. So please do join us. It's 5 to 7 p.m. in R201, the main building. If you want to join us, make sure you're reading the chapters, and to get the chapters, you need to register for it. There are multiple ways you can find that link. One is to go on the website for the SOAS Walter Rodney Collective, which is very easy to find on Google. Another way is to find us on Twitter at WRCHR_SOAS, where you'll find the link as well. So thank you all for coming today. Excited to continue this conversation in the foyer. And thank you, Tim, for an incredible talk.